For more than 6 years, a man in Ireland told the same heartbreaking story to anyone who would listen. His wife had left him. She had walked out one ordinary morning, taken her savings, and disappeared to start a new life somewhere far away. He told it to the police, he told it to his neighbors, and he told it more than a dozen times on national television, his eyes filling with tears as he pleaded with her to come home. It was a convincing performance. For years, much of the country believed him. There was only one problem. His wife had never left him at all. She had never gone anywhere. Every single time Richard Satchwell sat in front of a camera and grieved for his missing wife, Tina, she was only a few feet away from him. Wrapped in plastic, sealed under a thick slab of concrete, buried in a deep grave beneath the stairs of the very home he was sitting in. To understand how a man hides a body in his own house and then goes on television to weep about it, you have to understand the marriage. Tina Satchwell was born in 1972. She and Richard lived in the seaside town of Youghal in County Cork, Ireland. From the outside, people knew them as a couple, but those who looked closer would later describe something darker underneath. At his trial, Tina would be described as his trophy. Richard was portrayed as an arch manipulator, a man who worked to isolate his wife, to control the world around her, to keep her within reach. This was not a partnership of equals. It was something more possessive, more suffocating, the kind of relationship where one person slowly becomes the other person's property. That word, property, matters because it explains the mindset that would come later. A man who sees his wife as something he owns does not grieve like a man who has lost a partner. He guards, he controls, and when control slips away, he can convince himself that whatever he does next is somehow justified. Tina was a real person, with her own inner life, her own wishes, her own quiet unhappiness in that house. But in the story her husband was building, she was a possession that had gone missing. And a possession does not get the truth. It gets whatever story is most convenient for the person who owned it. And then, on the 20th of March, 2017, Tina Satchwell died at his hands inside their home. By his own eventual account, given only years later once he had no other choice, Tina came at him that morning in a rage. He claimed she flew at him with a chisel, and that to defend himself, he held a cord to her neck until she went limp in his arms. Whether any part of that story is true, a jury would one day reject the idea that this was some innocent act of self-defense. What he did next tells you far more than his words ever could. He did not call for help. He did not call an ambulance or the police or a neighbor. Instead, he set about hiding her. According to what he later described, he placed her body on a couch. Then he moved her into a chest freezer. And a few days later, on the 26th of March, he dug a grave beneath the stairs of their home, laid her inside it, and sealed her away. He wrapped her in black plastic. He covered her in a thick layer of concrete, more than a meter deep. And he built a new brick partition over the spot, hiding the fresh work, turning a corner of his own house into a tomb. Every step of that took time and effort and a clear and steady head. This was not the frantic act of a man in shock, unsure of what he was doing. Moving a body to a freezer and leaving it there for days, and then digging a grave deep enough to swallow it, and mixing and pouring concrete and laying bricks into a fresh wall. All of that is hours upon hours of deliberate, careful labor. And at any single point across those hours, he could have stopped and put down the tools and picked up a phone. He never did. He kept working, methodically, until the woman he had killed was hidden well enough that he believed the world would never find her. And then, having buried his wife under his own staircase, Richard Satchwell walked back out into the world and began to lie. On the 24th of March, 4 days after she died, He walked into a Garda station and reported Tina missing. His story was smooth and specific. Tina had left him, he said. She had grown restless, wanted to find herself, and had simply gone, taking around 26,000 euros in savings with her. It was the kind of story that sounds sad but ordinary. People drift apart, people leave. A wife walking out on a controlling husband was, if anything, an easy thing to believe. But look closely, and the story starts to fray. A woman who genuinely runs away to start a new life usually leaves some trace of a new life somewhere. A bank card used, a phone switched on, a message to a friend or a family member at some point across years. Tina left none of that. She simply ceased to exist in the world, cleanly and completely, the way a person does not when they have run away, but does when they are dead. And there was the matter of what she left behind. This was a woman who adored her pets, who cared deeply for the animals in that home. The idea that she would abandon everything she loved and walk into thin air with nothing but cash asked people to believe a great deal. And Richard Satchwell leaned into that story with everything he had. Over the years that followed, he did not hide from attention. He sought it out. He gave interview after interview, more than a dozen media appearances in total, including on some of the most watched programs in the country. He sat under the studio lights and spoke tenderly about the woman he missed. He appealed directly to her, asking her to make contact, to just let him know she was safe. To the public watching at home, here was a devoted husband, heartbroken and bewildered, holding out hope that his wife would one day come back through the door. It was one of the most audacious performances imaginable, because the man asking the nation to help find his wife knew exactly where she was. He had put her there. Every tear, every appeal, every sad and searching interview was delivered by a man who could have walked from the television studio back to his home, stepped into his own sitting room, and stood directly on top of her grave. For a long time, the lie held. The case went cold. The years passed, and Tina Satchwell, to the outside world, remained a woman who had simply chosen to disappear. But not everyone was convinced. Slowly, the doubts began to gather. There were pieces of the story that did not sit right. A woman who left to start a new life, yet took so little that truly mattered to her. A husband whose grief was always so public, so performed. The more investigators looked at the shape of the story, the more they began to suspect that the truth was not out there somewhere in the wider world. The truth was much closer to home. It has to be said that this realization was slow in coming, and later it would draw hard questions. People would ask how a woman could lie buried beneath her own staircase for more than 6 years before anyone dug there. Politicians and commentators would question how the original investigation had been handled, and why it took so long to treat the home itself as the most obvious place to look. Those are fair questions, and they matter, because every year that passed was another year that Richard Satchwell got to keep telling his story unchallenged. But eventually, the tide of suspicion turned, and the investigation finally pointed itself in the one direction it should perhaps have looked much sooner. More than 6 years after Tina vanished, the investigation changed course. This time, the focus was not on where she might have gone. It was on the house she had never actually left. In October of 2023, investigators returned to the Satchwell home, and this time, they came to search it properly. They brought in a specialist cadaver dog, an animal trained to detect the scent of human remains. Her name was Fern, and as she worked her way through the house, Fern alerted to one specific area: the ground beneath the stairs. For the officer standing there, that alert would have landed like a stone dropping in the stomach. For more than 6 years, they had been chasing a living woman, a wife who had supposedly chosen to disappear into the wider world. And now a dog was telling them, with the plain certainty that only a dog can offer, that the answer had never been out there at all. It had been inside these 4 walls the entire time. Right here, beneath a staircase that people had almost certainly walked past again and again on earlier visits to this very house. As the search team examined that spot, they began to notice things that should not have been there. The concrete in that area was a different color, as though it had been poured separately at a different time. There was a brick partition that seemed crudely built, added after the fact, closing off a section that had no obvious reason to be closed off. To a trained eye, it did not look like part of the original house. It looked like something had been covered up. The next day, building contractors were brought in to break through the floor and dig. Beneath the concrete, in a deep grave under the stairs, they found the skeletal remains of Tina Satchwell. She had been there the entire time. Through every search, every appeal, every tearful interview, she had lain beneath the feet of the man who killed her in the home they had shared. Richard Satchwell was arrested. This time, he was not the grieving husband reporting a wife who had left. This time, he stood accused of killing her. His trial took place years later, and it lasted almost 5 weeks. So much time had passed, and the remains were so decomposed that the exact cause of Tina's death could no longer be determined by science. Richard offered the jury his story of the chisel and the struggle, his claim that he had never meant for her to die. But the jury saw what the whole arc of his behavior revealed. An innocent man does not entomb his wife in concrete beneath the stairs. An innocent man does not spend 6 years performing grief on national television over a death he caused. The concealment, the elaborate lie, the years of manipulation, all of it spoke louder than his account of that single morning. There's a reason juries are allowed to weigh not just the killing, but everything a person does afterward. A genuine accident, a true moment of terror, sends a person running toward help. What Richard Satchwell did was the precise opposite. Every choice he made after Tina died was aimed at one thing: making sure no one ever found out. You do not build a wall over an accident. You do not pour concrete over a tragedy you did not cause. And you certainly do not sit in front of a camera year after year and grieve on demand for the person you are actively hiding. On the 30th of May, 2025, after deliberating for less than 10 hours, the jury found Richard Satchwell guilty of the murder of Tina Satchwell. A few days later, he was sentenced to life in prison. Even then, he insisted he had never meant to kill her and signaled that he would appeal. But the verdict stood. After 8 long years, the word the Satchwell family had waited for was finally spoken aloud in that courtroom. Guilty. Now sit with the full weight of what this case really is. Most murders are terrible in a single violent moment. This one was terrible for more than 6 years, every single day, on purpose. The killing itself was only the beginning. What followed was a long, deliberate campaign of deception, carried out by a man who buried his wife under his own home and then chose, again and again, to look the world in the eye and lie about it. Think about the coldness that requires. To pour the concrete, to build the wall, to report her missing to the very police who would eventually dig her up. To sit in a television studio, summon tears, and beg a woman to come home when you know she is lying dead beneath your staircase. That is not the panic of a moment. That is a performance sustained across years over the body of the person you claim to love. And think too about everyone he pulled into that lie. The police who spent their time and resources searching for a woman who was never lost. The journalists who gave him a platform in good faith, believing they were helping a desperate husband. The strangers watching at home who felt their hearts break for him, who maybe kept an eye out for Tina in case they ever crossed her path. He used every one of them. He borrowed the genuine compassion of an entire country and spent it as cover for what he had done. That is its own kind of violation, layered on top of the killing itself. A whole nation was made to grieve for a lie. Tina Satchwell deserved so much more than the life she was given, and far more than the death she was handed. She spent her final years being controlled by the man who would kill her, and then she spent more than 6 years hidden away, denied even the dignity of being searched for honestly. Her own home, the place she should have been safest, was turned into her grave. In the end, it was a suspicious patch of concrete and a dog named Fern that spoke the truth her husband had spent 6 years burying. The stairs he walked up and down every day, the wall he built with his own hands, could not keep her hidden forever. She was found, she was named, and the man who put her there and then wept for the cameras finally answered for all of it.